good evening. This is Hound Dog Steve coming to you on the 20th of January, and thank you very much for joining me this evening. I'd mentioned in a previous video that I was going to do a little research on some of the background as to why people were migrating, because this is becoming a really big issue around the world. And oh my God, I really didn't have to go looking too far to unearth some really interesting articles, which once you read some of them, you realize why we have so much migration, why we have so much anger. But first, a warm welcome to all of you returning subscribers, and to any new subscribers joining me this evening. Please join the conversation. I'm trying to research out and bring you news items from all over the world, and maybe discuss some of the grassroots issues underlying some of the problems that we are seeing in the world today. Okay, so I don't want to spend too much time talking right now because we have a lot of clips to go see, and when we come back I will do a quick wrap up. Okay, let's go take a look at those clips. Here we go. So let's start here, shall we? CSR Wire. Chevron demands victims of its Amazon pollution pay $33 million for court costs in Ecuador environmental case. New York. Although Chevron refuses to pay a historic $12 billion environmental judgment for polluting the Amazon, the oil giant is now trying to force Ecuadorian rainforest inhabitants who live in communities devastated by the company's toxic waste to turn over $837,000 and possibly as much as $32 million for costs and legal fees associated with its discredited retaliatory racketeering case in the United States. Chevron has destroyed much of our precious rainforest and still refuses to accept responsibility, Camacho said. For Chevron and an American judge to now demand that the very people who suffer from the company's pollution should pay court costs is insulting and arrogant. Communities should not do business with Chevron because it respects neither the environment nor its people. And this from TRT World. Public notice, prohibition, water not fit for use. How big oil corporations are destroying life in Nigeria's Ogoniland. For about 1 million people in Ogoniland, the effect was immediately disastrous. Fishermen like Veem, whose families included his aging parents rely on revenue from fishing to feed themselves and to send their children to school, were left with nothing. The entire aquatic life was destroyed, Veem told TRT World. The first few months after the spills occurred were the worst. In Bomu there were no fish at all for the fishermen to catch, even when they went deep into the open sea. The mangrove forests that wrapped the river like a cocoon disappeared, taking with them the abundant periwinkles, shellfish and oysters the villagers used to pick easily. An entire ecosystem had been killed in the space of months. Nigeria has the largest oil-producing mines in Africa, and the bulk of its crude lay beneath farmlands and rivers in Ogoniland. Companies like Shell extract about 100 million barrels of crude every year and generates billions of dollars in revenue. Shell alone has up to 50 facilities in the Niger Delta region. While mining in the Ogoniland has gone on for over 6 decades, residents say they have hardly benefited from the wealth generated from their land. Around 70% of the Ogoniland population lives in poverty. The very resource that is supposed to bring development has destroyed the land. Many believe, pointing fingers at Shell. The company, which started pumping oil in 1958, has been accused of gross mismanagement of its 5,000-kilometre network of pipes, many of which have become weak and corrosive, leaking oil into the soil and water. Amnesty International estimates that Shell and Eni spilled over 5 million litres of oil in 2014 alone. After the 2009 spill, another in 2012, Shell claimed to have cleaned up the areas affected. But in 2015, Amnesty International again accused Shell of using glossy marketing to disguise half-hearted cleanup attempts. From The Guardian, this is absolutely amazing. Just 100 companies responsible for 71% of global emissions. A relatively small number of fossil fuel producers and their investors could hold the key to tackling climate change. So if it's just 100 companies, And how many companies are there in the world? How much are we responsible for? Maybe 1 or 2%? 3%? And yet we have to pay for all of this, not the corporations. Or the governments who protect them. Isn't that interesting? Again, The Guardian. Oil industry devastating for Amazon communities, warns UN rapporteur. Indigenous people in Peru have suffered devastating consequences as a result of extractive industries in the Amazon rainforest, according to the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Indigenous Rights. During a week-long trip into the country, James Anea visited indigenous communities in Loreto, an Amazon region which has been heavily contaminated over the last 40 years by oil companies. In particular, he visited an oil concession known as Block 192, formerly Block 1AB. I have been able to personally confirm the serious environmental problems that exist in this zone due to the oil industry, Anea said. This includes the contamination of the body of waters and the soil used by the indigenous people in this region, which has affected their food sources and their health. How mine dumps in South Africa affect the health of communities living nearby. Mining is a major economic activity in many developing countries. In South Africa, mining of gold, coal and other natural resources has played a significant role in the country's economy, with both positive and negative consequences. Mining companies are often criticized for dumping waste without taking the necessary precautions. The result is a significant amount of air, soil and water pollution. One particular area of concern is mine dumps, which are made up of crushed, sand-like byproduct refuse material known as tailings, produced during the mining process. Mine dumps are made up of a complex mixture of metals and dust particles. This means that dust exposure can be high for communities living nearby, particularly during windy conditions when it's dry and vegetation cover is low. An estimated 1.6 million people live in informal and formal settlements on or directly next to mine dumps in South Africa. People living in these settings tend to be historically marginalized and in the main poor. We set out to study the effect of air pollution on these communities. These are the first studies to look at the impact of dust particles from mine dumps on the health of children and elderly people. Okay, here's an interesting article by Esquire. We bear responsibility for the conditions in Honduras causing its people to flee. Okay, this is the interesting part. Before we get into this latest atrocity committed in our name, let's go back to October 23rd, 1998. On that date, the CIA declassified the report by its Inspector General regarding what the CIA was doing in Honduras as part of the general and bloody Reagan administration meddling in Central America in the previous decade. Thanks to the irreplaceable National Security Archive, we learned that the Honduran military was freed up to make war on its own people, so that the United States could keep using the country as a staging area for its own adventurism elsewhere in the region. The report indicated that the CIA knew contemporaneously about the abuses which were occurring and did not report on them as it should have done, even though Honduras was the linchpin of U.S. Central American policy during the Reagan administration. Despite CIA knowledge of Honduran military abuses, more than $1 billion in U.S. taxpayers' money flowed to the Honduran military through the 1980s. The CIA knew there was blood on the hands of the Honduran military, but covered it up, providing impunity for rights abusers and misleading the U.S. Congress and public, noted National Security Archive Research Fellow Susan Peacock. She called the release of the IG report a step towards the disclosure which President Clinton promised vis-à-vis human rights abuses in Latin America. Despite the Clinton administration's commitment to Congress to release the report to the fullest extent possible, major portions, including critical sections on CIA involvement in torture or hostile interrogations and possible accountability issues, are blacked out. And there he is, Ronnie Reagan. Here's a piece from this week. When America meddles in foreign elections, it doesn't hack, it murders. As an initial matter, it's important not to overstate things. Hacking internal communication from one campaign to embarrass them is not the rigging of an election. So far as we know, the actual election procedures were not compromised, the ballot boxes were not stuffed, the counts were not falsified, and the people were not prevented from voting, with the exception of Republican states defying federal court orders to stop disenfranchising black people. That makes the Russian hack far less interference than what happened to, say, Iran in 1953, when the CIA and the British government forcibly removed a democratically elected prime minister and made the weak Iranian monarch into a brutal, torturing dictator. Or Guatemala, where a US-backed coup in 1954 installed a right-wing dictator, touching off a 36-year civil war that killed maybe 200,000 people. Or Chile, where a US-backed coup in 1973 installed a right-wing dictator who killed thousands and imprisoned or tortured tens of thousands. Or Congo in 1960. Or Haiti on half a dozen occasions, and on and on and on. Even when we aren't murdering democratically elected leaders of foreign countries to protect oil companies or fruit companies, or because of hysterical paranoia about communism, America has non-violently meddled with elections all over the place. Before they overthrew Chilean President Salvador Allende in 1973, US agents lost him to the 1964 election with a blizzard of cash and propaganda. Political parties with bags of cash, fabricated smear campaigns, and other dirty tricks. It has similarly meddled in France, Paraguay, Costa Rica, Panama, Portugal, Bolivia, and many others. And here we are, New York Times. Now this is back in 1997. This is when the New York Times was a paper to be respected. Members of both political parties expressed horror at accusations that the Chinese may have tried to use covert campaign donations to influence American policy, but the United States has long meddled in other nations' internal affairs. Since the end of World War II, the United States, usually acting covertly through the CIA, has installed or toppled leaders on every continent, secretly supported political parties of close allies like Japan, fomented coups, spread false rumors, bribed political figures, and spent countless billions of dollars to sway public opinion. If the Chinese indeed tried to influence the election here last year, the United States is only getting a taste of its own medicine, said Peter Kornbluh, a researcher at the National Security Archive, an organization affiliated with George Washington University that monitors intelligence and foreign policy. And of course, we're not even taking into account the next wave of migrants, taking India's climate migrants seriously. In India, close to 1.5 million people are classified as internally displaced every year, many for climate change reasons. So we're going to see this worldwide. It's coming, folks. So we need to talk about this right now. Those clips that I picked were just a few samples of the many hundreds that I could have chosen, but the video would have just been way too long. It's going to be long as it is. But these are all grounds for public anger. Okay, so we have America is building a wall to the south of us to keep Hondurans, from entering on its southern border. And whilst I agree that mass migration is not good news for anybody, it can overwhelm the host country very, very quickly as services start to fall apart with the sudden demand, and that doesn't solve anybody's problems. But what I really do see missing from this discussion is, why aren't these corporations cleaning up their messes? Why aren't our governments holding these corporations' feet to the fire? These are the people who are causing all of the problems. The root causes of terrorism start with these corporations and the way they behave in other countries. And the unfortunate thing is that unless you go rooting around in newspapers or news items from those countries, you don't hear about that in North America. This is completely absent from our corporate media, and this is lies by omission. This corporate media knows exactly what is going on. It knows that Apple employees are jumping out of windows in China and doesn't talk about it. They just talk about Apple stock. Well, as long as this goes on, you will not be able to build a wall high enough, long enough, or deep enough. And it seems to me wherever you look in the world, this has been taking place. Now, I'm going to link below an incredible little documentary called The Secret of the Seven Sisters. And this is the story of big oil from 1923, pretty well up to the present day. And it highlights some of the double dirty dealing that has gone on with the countries, the people, their environment, and it is an absolute disgrace. And if you want to know why we have terrorism today, look no further than these corporations meddling in other people's business, their resources, and they're doing this because they know that the governments of those countries are not strong enough to stand up to them. And with the threat of US military might or British military might, you know, I mean, we have the coalition of the willing destroyed Libya and Syria. Those countries should have been left alone to sort out their own internal problems, just as we sort out our own internal problems. I mean, can you imagine, you know, Syria and Libya got together and said that they thought that, you know, there was a problem the way North America was being run, and they were going to get together a coalition of the willing and take them out? Can you imagine what our response would be? So until we have governments that force these corporations to take responsibility in the cleanup, I mean, it's one thing to take labour over to these third world countries and to try and raise them out of poverty. And again, you know, this was what was going through my head through the entire documentary, The Secret of the Seven Sisters, is, couldn't you have shared? Couldn't you have helped these governments to build a stable infrastructure, a strong government, a good healthcare system, raise these people out of poverty into a decent middle class standard of living? What would it have cost you? Really? 10%? 15% of your profits? But you couldn't even do that, could you? Well, don't ask why when the guillotines start rolling out onto the streets, because this populist uprising is what that's all about. Because you and I didn't do that. It's the corporations and the governments who do not hold them accountable. And when you have a media which is complicit in all of this, that refuses to bring this information or does so in such a way that it is not seen by the general public, this is collusion at the highest level, my friends. Okay, well, please, if you've enjoyed this video, like and subscribe below. Please write a comment. I would love to hear what you've got to say on this issue. And in the meantime, on this very, very cold January evening, this is Hound Dog Steve signing off, wishing you a great week coming up, and we will talk very, very soon. You take care now. See ya. Bye.